Welcome to A Shot in the Arm podcast. I'm Ben Plumley and we're reporting from AIDS 2022. Well, this is a special little extra bit. We're sharing the mic with Frontline AIDS and I'm delighted to be joined again by Oratile Moseki. Hi, Oratile.
Hi, Ben. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Yeah, here we are at the end of the conference. We can still talk and we've still got energy.
Yeah, so a little bit left, a reserve. We have a reserve, yeah.
So you and I did a podcast at the start of the conference where we previewed what we hoped would come out of the Montreal conference. And we also had a chance to preview the major report that you worked on, Protectors or Predators, the role of law enforcement in frankly damaging the AIDS response through illegal behaviors. You had a satellite symposium this morning to talk about the report. How did that go?
Oh, it was really excellent. I mean, it was a really early satellite. We got it at 8 in the morning. We are, though, thankful that it might have been early for us, but it was actually good timing for the communities and stakeholders that really need to hear the message and to read the report. And in sub-Saharan Africa and many parts of Africa as well that do similar work to what was presented in the report, as well as in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So it was really good. It was well attended. We had an excellent lineup of panelists. It was moderated by Kate Thompson, who's the head of Community Rights and Gender Department at the Global Fund. And Kate Thompson has always been a huge champion, and CRG and the Global Fund of the work that we do on community-led monitoring. In fact, they fund the vast majority of our work on community-led monitoring of human rights across the world. So we're really glad to get her to moderate the session. We also had panelists who are contributors to the report. So we had the program manager for the AIDS Foundation for South Africa, AFSA, which is the principal recipient for human rights programs in South Africa that they coordinate, the South African REACT program. The program that we lead is called REACT. And her name is Dina Chabangu. We also had Liberty Matese, who is the executive director of Gender Dynamics, which is a trans-led activist organization.
And of course, Liberty was a guest and very articulate in the podcast that we did. Actually, I got to be honest with you, Oratile, between her and Victoria from APH Ukraine, they're the ones who brought tears to my eyes.
Powerhouses.
Oh my gosh. But Victoria wasn't on the panel this morning. Who was from the Alliance for Public Health?
Victoria wasn't on, but she was in the audience. Both Victoria and Nadia actually both were there, but APH was represented by another colleague of theirs, Tanya Deshko, who is the Director of International Programming at APH, so she was there. I don't know if you know, but I think Tanya and others had actually received awards for their tireless work at AIDS2022. So we're so thankful that she was able to participate. And then we also had Professor Michel Kazachkin, who is presently, of the many hats he wears, a commissioner for the ICA Global Drug Policy Commission.
Now, what does, I saw Kate mention ICA. What does that stand for?
Eastern Europe and Central Asia.
ICA, Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Yeah, I get that.
Acronym.
Yeah. So it's double ECA.
Double
so it's
ECA.
like ICA.
ICA, yeah. Shorthand. So he was there as well, and it was just amazing. You know, they got an opportunity to talk about the real experiences and to talk really about what I really liked, I think what struck me and really reaffirmed us, I think, as Frontline AIDS is understanding that whilst this is an HIV-related issue, because our mandate is around ending AIDS as Frontline AIDS, we have to be a little bit more intersectional and also consider this as an issue of democracy and governance. That what criminalization does is it creates an opening for corruption, and then it also puts into jeopardy the rule of law generally. And you know, if you have a rule of law that state actors themselves are not adhering to, you're creating chaos in a country.
Absolutely.
And it's very pervasive. So it's everybody's problem. Yeah.
So the report, for me, has been one of the highlights of the conference.
Right.
And it's been so because it's not only well written and articulated, but there's data there. I mean, it's qualitative data, but you've really focused on providing evidence.
Yeah.
Can you give me some stories that you reported on this morning?
Oh man,
showing that?
There's so many stories that we can talk of. Just to say, we didn't present a lot of the quantitative data, although there's a lot of it. For one reason, this was an exploration of a new kind for us, and so what we found out pretty quickly is how different countries are. The thing that joined all the countries together, however, is that every single country represented in that report, and a lot of the others that we did not report on, are experiencing unlawful policing practices. How that is manifested in different countries is different, and therefore it's really important to have a local response, even though there's a kind of a global solidarity around the issues. And once there's variability, then you don't want to draw generalized conclusions about everybody. You want to be as accurate as you can.
Yeah, totally.
But again, like you said, really the value of our data, our monitoring system is in the qualitative data, but it is just the testimonies.
Yeah.
And the report found over 2,412 cases of police violations. I know the exact figure. Out of, I think, I would say, estimate around 13 to 14,000 cases in total. So we kind of honed in on that, and we started to kind of parse out what are the kinds of stories to give people a real life experience. The one that touched me the most, I'll say, Ben, is the one I remember very exactly where I was when I was exploring the data, is the story that we shared at the conference about the man from Kazakhstan who in February 22 had reported a case of violation where he had been apprehended by a police officer on his way to actually get a job. He was a man who had not been using drugs for over 9 years, but because of his previous, the police officer who apprehended him knew him from the past, and just assumed he must be a drug user, and therefore, so that's what criminalization does, is it doesn't criminalize the conduct. It basically criminalizes the whole individual, and then you become that, right? So he got apprehended. He was searched by the police officer. The police officer accused him of stealing hatches. So hatches are kind of the covering on drain, on, you know, when you drainage, the metal coverings. Yeah. And then he also took something out of the man's pocket and said it was heroin. Now, this man says it had been planted, basically, was what he was saying. And he said, that's not mine. I haven't used heroin in 9 years. I haven't used any drugs in 9 years. And there is a back and forth between him and the police officer where he was saying, look, and the police officer was saying, either you agree to this or you give me money. Oh. So I'll let you go if you give me equivalent of $40. Luckily, which is really important to remember, luckily, friends of his came to his help. Friends of his, neighbors of his came to his help and were witnesses to the occasion. That made the police officer backtrack a little bit in terms of how he was speaking to the man, but he still insisted on him getting the money. Now, if you recall, this is a man who was on his way to do in his life.
Right.
You know,
right.
And this is why we're saying a lot of these cases, it's police violence that happens in virtually every single space. There's no safe space.
There was one other example in the satellite symposium this morning from South Africa about a trans woman,
right.
And that her home was raided by police who basically abused her body.
Yes, before I get to that one, because that's also, I don't know if I can call it one of my favorites. In fact, there's many, many like that. I just want to finish that one last story.
Oops, sorry.
Which is because the man, his story was recorded by him, and then it was recorded by the documenter who had followed up with him about the case. What happened with that man is that man went home. he drank a bottle of vodka straight, and he fell asleep and never woke up again. So it was a case of somebody who had actually died from the stress of the occurrence that had happened. So these are the kinds of cases that we're seeing, where people are trying to empower themselves, people are trying to live their best lives, and they're still experiencing abuse. But on to this, the story about the trans woman who was speaking about her, being apprehended by the police and undergoing an illegal body search. We call it an illegal body search, but really, truthfully, what it is a sexual assault.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a sexual assault. We need to name these things for what they are, really, you know. It was clear that he was just searching her because he was curious to know, because she had told him that I'm a woman, even though I think she might have presented ID documents that were not aligned to her gender. And then he did something really cruel, which he then said to her, oh, now that I've searched you, if you want to be searched by a female police officer, I can take you to the station. So and we see so many of those cases happening, not just in South Africa, but actually across all of our partners. So, I mean, if people just put themselves in the shoes, how would you like to be groped and fondled and touched in private places? It's just beyond my understanding. It's really, really horrible.
You know, the thing for me, I mean, this is an outrage from a human rights perspective and from the perspective of respecting people's right to live their life the way they want to. And for people who have used drugs and who are, you know, making a journey out of that, there has to be a point where we respect and support that journey. But it's also critical from an infectious disease point of view, because these are our communities who are most affected by HIV. And not only do we drive them underground, we also, through this kind of behavior, reinforce the distrust, the concern, the anxiety about interacting with authorities. These are recipes for greater HIV infections.
No, 100%. And we call it an absurdity, because I think we all know this, but maybe we need it reaffirmed, is that the fundamental function of the police is to protect human rights. That is their number one job and responsibility. That's what they are here for, fundamentally, from an ethical and moral point of view. That's the impetus and reason for their work. Secondly, in order for them to do their jobs properly in policing crimes, let's say, or public order, they need to have the trust and the rapport of the people that they are policing. And when you violate the rights of those of communities, you are sending the message, one, that is not important to them, and they cannot come to you when their rights are violated by other people, which is another finding that we found. You're also saying that, you know, in some ways you're compromising the whole institution of policing. Yeah. And when it comes to the impact on HIV, there's so many very direct indications and instances where we see where people are seeking out, let's say, harm reduction services and are being apprehended right at the the opioid substitution therapy site, OST site. What is that? I mean, I don't need to tell you what happens next, right? You just don't go back, right? I mean, so there is lots of those instances in the report.
So where do you go from here? How do we make sure this report, beautifully presented and reported, generated interest? How do we take it now to a policy level and change behavior, change legislation and other behavior? What are your plans next?
Well, I could talk at length about the approach that we take. I think everybody, though, is aware it's an ecological approach, which means you start with the perpetrator. And my colleagues and partners were speaking about, don't try and think too big all the time. There's very many different ways to do advocacy. One is, if something has happened, you need to respond, which is a big part of what we do with our data. We don't just collect it, we respond, or react, as we say. Is find opportunities, if it is safe to do so, to speak to the perpetrator and change hearts and minds one step at a time at community level. And then I guess the second level is what we found really works very well is championing, in this instance, is by police commissioners themselves. And that has actually been found to be the case across a lot of work that's been done around police abuse, is because they are an institution of command, a chain of command. When you have as well as healthcare is a similar thing. Once you have the leadership of an institution saying we must ban unlawful policing practices, it becomes much easier for communities to then say. So in fact, there's a great example, I think, that one of our partners gave where, I'm trying to remember the country, I would like to say
Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan. I would like to say that, but it could be another country, so forgive me if I'm getting it wrong. But the instances where there was a lot of violations that were happening against key population groups, and what they did was they went directly to the director of health or the minister of health and said, this is what's happening, this is what our evidence is telling us from REACT, do something about it. And he said, oh, I had no idea. And he wrote them a letter of support. And what the organization did was excellent. They printed out that letter and they handed it out to the community members. And every time a community member was being apprehended by the police for no good reason, they just took out the letter and said, your boss says you should leave me alone. Right. So it's that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, that's the most important, I think. But obviously, there are other things like supporting communities to share their data, to have their data respected and appreciated at national level, have a seat at the table in national policy decision making. And then obviously for spaces like AIDS2022 is having communities who are doing this work coming to speak on their own behalf. I mean, I see a time when I'm not sitting, I mean, I sit in Brighton, I love this work, but it would be really nice to have people at the front line speaking on these issues themselves.
Yeah, although I do think of you as the front line. You are.
Yeah, we are.
You are incredibly passionate and driven. And I know for this conference, this was really your priority. You were preparing for this, head down, getting this report out. In your peripheral vision, did you see anything else at the conference that stood out to you? Anything that really impacted you?
I mean, I had my head down. Can I speak on some tangential events that were happening? Because I just want to be a little bit more accessible, that AIDS22 also brought other opportunities for other groups to come out and do stuff. Then I'll speak about AIDS22. One is Global Black Pride Conference that happened in Toronto. So I went there. Global Black Pride is, as you know, is a new initiative of the last 2 years, but incredibly successful and powerful, of a kind of a community of global LGBT activists from around the world who come together to raise attention to the experiences of Black and Brown LGBT community members, and in trying to see that intersectionality is key and how it manifests differently being a person of color. I had gone there in support of the chairperson happens to also be a board trustee of
Michael Iguodaro.
Frontline AIDS, and I know a good friend of
and he's a friend
of the
podcast.
Yeah,
yes, absolutely.
It was excellent. I mean, we had everybody. The Canadians came out. I have to send a shout out to Blackness Yes that supported it, as well as Toronto Pride Toronto, they call it, as well as other organizations. It was excellent. So I just want to give a shout out to them. They were in Toronto doing their thing. What else? We also did a screening of a documentary film about the life and activism of a Cameroonian activist named Yves Yom, that was done by Coalition Plus, which is a kind of francophone-based NGO working on HIV in collaboration with Impact, AGCS Plus, and many different others, and that was excellent as well. It connected with me because it was about sharing stories, and what we really want to emphasize now is there is space and time and importance around data and scientific data, but we really need to do more on sharing stories to understand the lived experiences, because we know that the last mile is inequalities are impeding the end to AIDS.
That's right, and the tagline to this conference was "Follow the Science." And when I first saw it, I went, "Ooh," because the value of this conference that takes place every 2 years is that it isn't just the science; it's community experience and leadership. Now, maybe we were doing it post-COVID because of all of the misinformation, but I think we missed a trick here.
We might have missed a trick in the thematic priorities, but I think civil society came out really, really strong. I think you can always count on them to challenge things. I was really touched by the speech that was given. I think you're going to have a podcast next with them, but with Vuyiseka Dubula from South Africa, who's a comrade who I have great respect for, and others in her group in the campaign, talking about all the issues about the inaccessibility of conferences like this to participants. I mean, we were really sad to see that. I know it's been talked at length, so I won't go back into it. But I was really encouraged and inspired by people just speaking up and speaking their minds, and that's what you can really rely on when you come to an AIDS conference.
Yeah. And Vuyiseka saying, you don't get to decide who is on this stage.
Yep.
I loved that. I loved that.
Yeah.
So you're heading back tonight?
Yeah.
Heading back to Brighton in the United Kingdom?
Actually, I'm a transnational person, so I am actually coincidentally also half Canadian. So that accounts for the accent. Although I'm from Botswana, I have 2 countries. I'm heading back to Toronto. So that's where I have some family members, and I'm going to take some time off.
Yeah, so not a heavy trip.
Not a heavy trip,
excellent.
Yeah.
So one last question. Surviving the conference this week, we had the Montreal Conference Centre, we had meetings in different hotels around the conference, including here at the lovely W Hotel. So, shoes. Was it form for you, or was it function? Did you wear fashion, or did you wear comfort?
I'm laughing because it's actually a funny story. I've been wearing function, and then I had to go to a cocktail, and I was trying to be I never dress up. So I went to the screening for the Yves Yom, Seeing Thousands, by the way. If you want to, it's going to be out on YouTube next year, I think, in social media. So please do look out for it next year. But I really tried to dress up, and then my shoe broke. So, so I did away with them, went back to my flats. Good question.
Sounds good. Well, Oratile, thank you so much for everything that you're doing. Thank you for being a guest on A Shot in the Arm podcast. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope we'll be able to invite you back again in the future and find out how your passion and your collaboration with colleagues is driving the agenda forward, tackling inequality. So it's been a real privilege. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks to the Shot in the Arm for having us.
Well, that's it for this particular episode of A Shot in the Arm podcast. We'll be back with one more wrap-up from AIDS 2022, but it just remains for me to thank you for watching. Subscribe, give us 5 stars, find us on all your favourite podcast platforms. Stay safe, stay healthy, and if you're still at the conference, stay hydrated.